Welcome back, everyone, to the LawCast. I'm Chris Easonton, and this is Melanie Thully. We are both solicitors here at MJT Law, and we're here for another week, another podcast. And this week we've been quite a focus in legislation on the kind of employment sphere. We've got a job summit. That's going on.
That has happened.
It has now happened.
It's happened. It's
2-day festival.
It's in the past, yes. 2 days last week. They brought a whole pile of people, 160 odd people together, industry experts.
Absolute who's who of industry.
Everybody wanted a seat at the table, which I find fascinating because you can't possibly have lots of asses on.
I would have loved to see. So the people who were there were everything from.
The Australian of the Year. There's CEOs. I know Alan Joyce was there. Twiggy Forrester was there. About 50 politicians, both state and federal. And about 40 unionists, and then about 30 lobbyists. That's right. And there was a couple of crossbench, backbench type seats available as well.
And I'd love to have seen how logistically that works because...
I'm not sitting next to him.
Yeah. And you've got 150 people and none of those people are going to be in the well, no one wants to be in the bleachers. I mean, I can't imagine Alan Joyce wants to be in the bleachers. No. In a seminar room or something.
That's right. He's got the best suit on.
Well, everyone wants to be in the front. So I don't know how logistically it worked.
No, it would have been hilarious. I wouldn't have liked to have been the person who arranged the seating.
No.
I do wonder though, if there was a conversation with any of these parties about, so Alan, you're sitting next to, blah.
And an email quickly came back.
And said, are you kidding? No.
Absolutely would have happened because that's what life's about. But the whole idea of it, we know that employment, it was somewhat of an election issue, but it didn't really, I don't think, swayed very many votes. And this is more so kind of playing out now that we have a new
I think you're
government.
right, because it was such... The problem with the election promises or the election issues is that both sides had them and they're almost exactly the same. We want to make changes.
Yeah. If there was one thing that was consensus... I certainly think around all 150 people there is that there probably is a change needed.
Everybody wants change.
Everyone wants change. No one feels as though this current system's working for them.
Yes.
In a way that makes sense.
Yes.
So obviously, something needs to change. What that change looks like, though, is really what's up for debate.
I really like this kind of rhetoric about collective bargaining and enterprise bargaining doesn't work. And and there was this language going around saying it was going to be synthetic striking.
Yes. And
there was this kind of language change or HR has moved to people and culture. There's been this kind of this change from sympathetic striking to collaborative industrial activity.
Which for everyone, I suppose for our listeners out there at the moment to have.
Collaborative industrial action.
Well, to have a protected industrial action, which is just legal sense for a strike, a lawful strike, because you can certainly have unlawful ones you might all get fired for it.
Protected industrial action. It was a rebrand from lawful striking.
Yeah, and you can only really do it if it's in relation to those your employment.
You can strike about something that's happening to you.
Yeah, essentially, and. Now the suggestion about having a collective bargaining where you've got multiple employers
and multiple
involved in the same agreement
as well,
such that theoretically there's an infinite amount, let's say there's 10 employers involved where all of those employees might be able to strike, and one of the
strike about somebody else's issue.
And one of the kind of reasons
collaborative industrial action.
One of the reasons they moved away from there, from what I understand, was. As an employer, you find yourself potentially facing industrial action where...
That's something you couldn't have...
You didn't really have control over.
Yeah, you didn't... That guy is not your employee. What the hell?
You didn't lead to that situation.
Anyway, I did read that there was a professor of industrial action kind of area having a bit of a chat to somebody in one of these newspapers in the
not in the news section, but in one of those interest sections.
Yep.
And he was of the view that enterprise bargaining doesn't work. Well, I'm pretty sure everyone's on board on that. But he said, collective bargaining works absolutely. And if you just have to look at the countries where collective bargaining works. And I was looking at these countries thinking, it doesn't work. One of the countries he mentioned was France, and we know that there was a strike in France with the truck drivers for literally months.
The country almost it almost crippled them.
I mean, yes, he said, places like England and America where they don't have it, the IR system just doesn't work. And I think comparisons to entirely different countries, entirely different cultural kind of setups is just too simplistic. And I think that he probably maybe wasn't asked the right questions, or he was edited in a particular way, because I cannot imagine that a professor in IR law would have just said something as broad brushstroke as, it works in this country, so it'll work in ours.
No, yeah.
Crazy.
But that's not just the only thing.
Yes, no. So, moving away from collaborative industrial activity.
We've got, obviously we need change, and they've put some kind of very broad.
And I was particularly interested in Workplace Relations Minister, Federal Workplace Relations Minister Tony Burke, who said the government is going to make immediate action on these things. So I brought them in today so we can have a chat about them. There are 8 points, and hopefully we'll get through them today. But the first one is stronger access for flexible working arrangements and unpaid parental leave. And what does that even mean?
So what are we thinking about access? We're thinking about eligibility.
We are, and we also, we're thinking about, so when we're talking about parental leave, we're not talking about maternity leave.
No, we're talking about parents.
So those who are watching out there, Australia had shifted away from the language of parental, from maternity leave or maternal leave a really long time ago, way back.
We were one of the first countries to do it, actually.
Well, really, and in fact, it's a discriminatory term. Yes, mum is actually giving birth to the baby, but there's it takes a village. So parental leave is about both parents taking leave that makes sense. And parental leave at the moment is all about the primary caregiver, and that doesn't have to be mum. No. It can be dad, and they can take turns on that.
No, and there is still, scope for the mother to take personal leave as well.
Yeah.
To actually recover from the medical side of it as well.
I saw a little bit about this. At the moment, parental leave, if you've worked for an employer for more than a year and you're a permanent employee, you are eligible, broad brushstroke here, but you're eligible to take unpaid parental leave for up to 18 weeks. They're looking at extending that to half a year. I've got real problems with that. Because as a small business, if I've got someone on parental leave, I might be able to cover them for 18 weeks. I'm not going to be able to cover them for 26. And who wants to take their job? It takes me a couple of months.
How are you going to fill it?
That's right. It takes me a couple of months to train somebody for that job, and then they're only going to be there 4 months. It's an incredibly expensive process for me.
And what you can imagine, most businesses, if they can, they're probably going to end up carrying capacity.
Yes.
In order to...
And what that causes there is a bunch of small businesses making these parents redundant. Because after 26 weeks of covering their job, you realise you don't need it anymore. And that's genuine.
Yeah.
It's a genuine problem.
It happens often. And it's nothing particularly...
And it's a cost thing. I'm not going to be able to afford to train someone for 2 months for a job of somebody who's already trained just for that person to leave 4 months later. And that's just too expensive for me. So it is better for me to find the gaps and cover the position.
Yeah.
And then what happens then is 5 months later, I look at it and go, well, what do I need it for?
Yeah.
So it is actually a real problem. I'm not saying that parents shouldn't take parental leave. But extending the leave, I don't know. It's going to cause a problem. I don't know. That's what they're talking about. But in this one, it's flexible working arrangements and unpaid parental leave.
So for flexible work arrangements, my hot take on it is, if we're thinking about eligibility, is to move it from, I apologise if I get this wrong, but from 1 year to 6 months, for example.
Yeah, maybe.
Or potentially immediately.
Yeah. Horrifying.
So being able to make your flexible working arrangement request
potentially
straight away
less time
instead of having been there for a year. Yeah, I agree. Also, I wonder whether they're going to buff up the flexible working arrangement requests. Every now and again I get a female that calls me who is a new parent who's taken the leave and has decided they don't want to go back for the full hours with which they had worked. And the rule is the job is open. Yep. And if you don't want that job, then there's a discussion with your employer. Now, that employer might accommodate, but eventually that employer might not accommodate. And the question I have from these parents is, but hang on, don't I have a right to get my job back? The trouble is they didn't want that job. They wanted a different job. And I'm wondering whether there's going to be more forcing of employers to say yes to these requests, which I think is inappropriate as well. Of course, we don't know. We're all talking about something here that the minister hasn't actually popped on the table that I'm aware of. But yeah, there's lots of things going on there, and I'm worried as a small business. I think it's brilliant if you're a parent. Absolutely brilliant. You've got probably more control than you'll ever have. But I'm just wondering if there's workarounds. I was talking about this to my husband, and I'm going to be very controversial here. I think for a small business, it might be cheaper to fire that employee, cop the penalty, than it is to retrain and take the time out of because I've got to take 2 months out of my normal work to retrain. Then I've got them for another 4 months. It actually, operationally, it's cheaper for me to fire that employee, unfair dismissal, pay them out, and move on.
I mean, it is also part
of
it is also part of their considerations is potentially increasing the penalties, and it's
maybe
how many provisions of the Fair Work Act it applies to.
Well, it's a double-edged sword, isn't it?
They're probably addressing that potential as well.
Yeah, that's true, but that's a real gun in your face. It's a real shotgun wedding.
Oh, yes.
Because now you're asking employers to take on so much risk, and then there might be a favouritism of those who aren't at childbearing years.
I mean, there's always a cause and effect with all of that.
You look at that and go, well, if you're going to make it harder for me to make decisions about my business, I'm just going to make decisions that suit me.
Yeah, you're going to have to take steps in your own hand.
Yeah, it's really, I'm interested to see how this is going to play out in practicality. Look, I think it's a bit of a mud thrown at a wall and seeing what sticks. The Fair Work Act feels like a little bit like that, and 2009, so 12 years later, 13 years later, we're probably going, it needs to be amended. It doesn't work.
I can see why there is some kind of willingness to change the flexible work arrangement provisions in light of COVID. I don't particularly think it needs to be changed, but I can see that it's at least being applied more.
Yeah, there's a lot of rhetoric out there.
I can see the reason why we might want to have a look at it. Whether we need to actually change is another question, but I can't imagine when they first drafted it, they'd realise that there was a period of time where there was on formal ones or informal ones.
Or technology moves on. And in this practice, it's almost impossible for someone to work remotely and still be as collaborative as they are in the office. And we know this because we've done it many, many times now in the last 3 years. But you can see if you've got a job that you don't really basically talk to your boss anyway. There is no collaborative. You just head down, bum up, do your job, go home. That you could do that at home. I just wonder why you want to do that at home.
It's very isolating. That's certainly what I got out of it.
Well, let's say you're at home. Are you preferring to be at home because you've got kids that you want to keep an eye on? And if that's the case, you're not doing your job. Is it you want to be at home because you want to be home at 3 o'clock on the dot and your job finishes at 2:50 p.m. and you don't want the travel? I want to know why people want to work from home.
Well, I mean, for everyone out there.
Yeah, absolutely.
I know that for a lot of people, if you've got an hour commute, taking an hour each way out of your day.
That's very true, and there's an expense, but does that mean they'll be willing to have a pay cut? Because they no longer have the expense of having to come into the office. They don't have to figure out how to get their lunch. They don't have to figure out how to get the travel. It's actually cheaper working from home for them.
Well, I doubt it, but
yeah, I think we should start looking at the bigger picture here, and not just it's flexible because it can be, but what are the benefits really? Why are you wanting to work from home? Is it you don't like your hour commute anymore when you moved an hour away from home, from work? You know, it's just...
I mean, there's obviously benefits both ways. Like, I actually haven't seen this being put out there as a benefit, but I actually think it is if you're a business and it's very difficult to maintain, if you've got a big enough workforce to maintain a good culture in an office. If you have some people that are working from home, it's a lot easier because you don't need to worry.
We don't worry about them being
They don't talk to each other.
To each other.
So, they don't talk to each other. They don't hang around each other.
Yeah,
so,
look,
I don't mind too much.
It's a very interesting point you make, but I just don't know how this is going to play. Anyway,
but what's next?
Stronger protections against adverse action, harassment and discrimination. And I took this as stronger protections for employers against rogue employees starting actions that are stupid, but you take this as in more protections for the employee.
Yeah, see, just being pragmatic in the way the kind of law is moving, I suspect it's to potentially broaden the application of those actions. I'm not sure how that, because all of those particular applications that one can bring are actually quite broad already.
I would like to be in the room when this was argued, because if you and I were sitting there as an employee, as an employer, I sit there and I hear every day from employers have all the rights here. They've got all the power. They can just start an action without having any kind of decent basis to it, and they can put me through a really expensive process for no reason. And that's what I hear every day. I hear every day from employees, my employer has all the power. They can just fire me for no reason. There's no recourse. Now, both are true, actually, and that's the problem. But I'd like to be in the room with all these industry experts,
absolutely,
having that argument.
I'm of the view that much of the problems and the issues you've raised there can be addressed by making it a cost jurisdiction. I understand why they put it in the first place, but I think the fact is it's playing out in a way that,
or at least lower the
advantage.
bar for the no cost part.
Maybe
not make it a cost jurisdiction, but actually lower that bar.
Because in doing so, you'll inevitably reduce the amount of applications going through.
I would like to see the bar lowered for legal advocates as well, to be charged for costs on these points, because there's an awful lot of organisations out there who are quite happy to rack up an employee to get fees, and they don't have to act in the best interest of that employee because they're a non-legal advocate. So I'd like to see more protections around that as well. Ensuring all workers, I like this one, ensuring all workers can negotiate in good faith, including women, small business, care and community service sectors and First Nations people. Not all those people are workers. Not all those entities are workers. Either this is poorly drafted or that's not what was actually said. So ensuring all workers negotiate in good faith. I don't even know what that means. I mean, what are we talking about here?
I think it's one which is a broad consideration for the benefits of collective bargaining.
I see what you're... Get rid of industrial action.
Well, the idea that the various representatives in those types of negotiations will be technically representing
everyone. This is a pleasant rewording, long-winded way of saying collective bargaining.
I mean, when you think about it in the advert,
whereas I hear
in the
collaborative
inverse,
industrial action.
If you the opposite to collective bargaining is free will contract. And
I like it.
I mean, and there's some views out there that free will contracts are not good for those particular.
Yes, okay, I get it. Okay, so the next one, ensuring all workers and businesses have flexible options for reaching agreement, including removing unnecessary limitations on single and multi-employer agreements, while ensuring that employers which negotiate single employer agreements are able to do so without those changes interfering. Look, whatever. I think you're just it's more about collective bargaining there. Making the better off overall test for agreement, this is for collective bargaining and enterprise agreements, approval simple, fair, flexible and fair. Now, I think that's talking about removing some of the other sections. Like, at the moment, better off overall is a better off overall. So you can give someone...
Terms and conditions.
Yeah, you can give someone something like, you can have casual Friday instead of...
Flexible working arrangement is kind of a good one, whereas if you were to integrate that into the actual agreement, you might, for example, be able to reduce the wages on the basis that you're incurring those costs.
Yeah, absolutely.
Expenses, I mean.
Yeah, absolutely. But I'm be interested in see how that pays off, because what that does, in my view, is it strengthens the monetary argument for the employees, and it weakens the employer's chance of giving non-monetary remedies. But we don't know what that means just yet. So I'm not going to get on a bit of a soapbox. I've got enough soapboxes today.
If they were to do it, one of the negative kind of implications of that is, from the employer's standpoint, the conditions of it. As an employee, you're far less likely to get kind of favourable conditions, I don't imagine, because everything is about a cost. You know, if they're going to think about wages globally, but how much does it cost to have that person in that seat, which includes conditions. Then if we have to, you know, if they have to do a certain percentage to get the agreement over the line for pay, then, you know, this other stuff's going to fall away because we can't afford it. We have to put it onto wages, and maybe that's what the workers want, but maybe it's not.
Giving the Fair Work Commission power to proactively help workers, particularly new entrants and small to medium businesses. Are we talking about a new kind of group inside the Fair Work Commission, a new kind of space there where we're getting mentorship and things like that? It's just a weird one. But this is immediate action. He's immediately acting this out, giving the Fair Work Commission power to proactively help workers, particularly new entrants and small to medium businesses. For a start, a small to medium business is not a worker again. I think the language is a bit weird, but
it's a bit sloppy, but sure.
Yeah, look, I think they're talking about a department inside a department, I guess.
I think it's going further than, you know, already there are a lot of kind of information out there that is published by various government entities to help businesses without the need for lawyers. But this sounds a little bit more in becoming involved on a almost case by case basis, not just putting a really good handbook out there or something like that.
That's right, and we're going to have to look at the funding on this point.
Yeah, because that sounds awfully expensive.
It really does. So the next one is ensure the process for agreement termination is fit for purpose and fair. Again, we're talking about enterprise bargaining. Again, we're talking about collective bargaining. It's fit for purpose and fair process of termination of these agreements. And that's a really interesting one, because all it takes is one person to put their hand up and say we want to terminate this agreement, and the employer is now in a bargaining stage, which is kind of interesting. Just before we step into that one, the second one I think we can talk about both at the same time. And this is sunset zombie agreements. Stop employers underpaying people with old agreements stuck in underwork choices. Now, obviously, that's a very negative language. So what they're talking about, agreements that are in place that haven't been altered, they are proper zombies.
And there are actually more of these out there than people realise. But essentially what happens is an agreement might have a nominal date.
That's right.
Of expiry, but it continues until it is removed, and it is removed by application to the Fair Work Commission.
That's right.
And
if it never happens, it never happens.
If it never happens, they either never negotiate it, or more frequently is that particular agreement was quite niche, and there's no longer anyone under that agreement.
That's right. It just gets set aside, and nobody remembers that it exists anymore. It just exists without anybody using it, which is unlawful as well. So it's kind of really interesting. So they're talking about the process of termination of agreements, and that's a lengthy, really time-consuming process to remove an agreement, and sunset dates for zombie agreements. Maybe this can be wrapped up in one thing. Your agreement terminates
on this date.
That's it. You know, we have fixed term agreements. I know that we don't, and I wasn't in the room when the conversation happened that we don't. But I do wonder why we don't. Maybe it's more expensive for the employer to have to, but the reversion is back to the awards, right? So
you're thinking about a situation where it terminates on this day. And then everyone goes back to the award as it might be, and then it's up to the parties again to kind of decide whether they want to re-engage
and maybe have an application process to extend the expiry date while
they negotiate.
While the negotiations are going on. So instead of
putting timeframes in place.
That's right. Instead of putting the cart before the horse, where it just goes on and on forever until it's terminated, it terminates and you have to make applications to keep it running. I wonder if that's a better process, but I don't know what's on the table.
I think there's actually a lot of merit to that, because one of the key criticisms of the way that we do enterprise bargaining at the moment is that...
For those who don't know, enterprise bargaining can take up to a year and a half, and it's incredibly expensive and incredibly time-consuming, and also very polarising.
Yeah.
While the parties are in these... they call it bargaining, but really it's just massive, aggressive negotiations. Yeah. And you're in aggressive negotiations with your own employees for a year and a half.
And it feels... That's how we end up, I think, with a them and us situation.
Yeah, kind of situation.
But I can see that if you had those dates in place, especially if they were strict. I think if you were to do it, you'd make them quite strict. Where you have a situation where at least it will motivate people to get it done quicker, because we know that when push comes to shove,
when time is of the essence, people get moving.
Those agreements can be done.
They can
in a matter of weeks.
I think, look, to be honest, it's in the interest of the advocacy groups to lengthen it out, and it's in the interest of the employee to keep it short. So I don't know how they're going to get a happy medium there. But that's it. That's on the table. The Honourable Tony Burke is going to be putting immediate action to these 8 points. Fascinated to see how that plays out. And
well, we've got a budget in October. Yes. I suspect there'll be some of that in there, especially, for example, around a new entity. And I'm expecting a new bill probably in the new year.
Brilliant for us. If you need any employment advice, we're basically on top of it, as on top of as anybody else is, and we'll keep it running forward.
Yeah. See you next time.
Thank you for watching. See you next time in the LawCast.
See ya.
Bye.